So let's go ahead and get started with the fun, shall we? I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today. Diana is a talent acquisition leader at DraftKings. DraftKings is a partner with Women Who Code year round, and we are so excited to have their support. Diana specifically has 15 years of experience focused on hiring top talent globally. She is really passionate about tech recruiting and creating and building recruiting processes and programs. She lives in the suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, with her husband and her two kids. Like I said, she is a wealth of knowledge. She's going to have a lot of great energy for us today and a lot of great information to share with you all. I'm so excited to be able to present Diana.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Christina, for that introduction. I am so excited to be here today talking to all of you. What I'm going to be sharing today is hopefully imparting some wisdom on how you can put your best foot forward in the tech interview process and common pitfalls to avoid. So before I get into the meaty stuff, I'm going to do just a quick introduction. I know Christina introduced myself as me as well, but I live in the suburbs of Boston. I've been in Massachusetts, give or take, the majority of my life. After high school, I went to UMass Amherst, where I studied accounting and psychology. I don't work in either of those fields today, but both of them have definitely helped to the success I've had in the HR and talent acquisition space. Over the past 20 years, I've had the opportunity to work for some amazing companies. I started my career at KPMG, a public accounting firm, as an auditor. After about 2 years, I had a midlife crisis in my early 20s and realized that this probably wasn't the best profession for me. And that's when I had the opportunity to switch into university recruiting at KPMG. So I spent a couple years at KPMG before making my next step to Vistaprint. And that's when I had the chance to really get into the tech industry. So some of you may know Vistaprint as the business card company, or they're a provider of marketing materials to small businesses. If you watch sports and you like the Celtics, Vistaprint also sponsors their team, so their name is on their jerseys. I spent about 7 years there building out their campus recruiting program. And from there, I had the opportunity to go to TripAdvisor. And TripAdvisor was really where I got the chance to expand my experience outside of the campus recruiting space. And I started to manage tech and product recruiting teams in addition to campus teams. And that's where I also stepped into more of a global talent acquisition role. After about 5 years at TripAdvisor, I ended up moving to DraftKings, where I am today. So I've been with DraftKings for about 3 years now, and I lead our global talent acquisition team. So I have about 50 team members on the recruiting team, and it consists of a recruiting marketing team, talent acquisition operations, and then recruiters. And like Christina said, I'm also a wife and mom of 2 children who are 9 and 10. So changing gears a little bit, I just wanted to share a little bit about DraftKings. Now, I know some of you probably know DraftKings from our consumer brand. You've probably seen our commercials or heard us on the radio, and you probably know us as a daily fantasy sports or a sports betting company. And that is who we are to our millions of customers worldwide. But who we are as a company and who we are to our employees is we're a sports entertainment technology company. We have a global presence. Our primary locations where our employees sit is either in North America or Europe. We have 7 locations in North America, and we have 5 locations in Europe. And our largest employee base in Europe is in Bulgaria. So we started as a company in 2012. So when we got to 2022, we had a chance to look back at our previous 10 years and think about where we had been, what we had accomplished. And then we took a step back and thought about, okay, where do we want to go in the future? What is the next 10 years going to look like for us? And that's when we focused on what is our mission? What is our vision? Who do we want to be as a company? What are we aspiring to be? And really, for us, it's we want to be one of the world's largest and most loved consumer companies. We want to create incredible and engaging experience for our customers globally. And we want to do this in a way that's entertaining, engaging, and responsible. So thinking about DraftKings, this just shows a timeline of where we've been and where we're going. So like I said, we started in 2012. We launched our first daily fantasy mobile app in 2013. By the end of that year, we had about 300,000 registered users. And then for the next 4 years or so, we really iterated on our daily fantasy offerings. And what has really been the turning point in our company of who we've become up until this point is in 2017, the US Supreme Court overturned the ban on federal ban on sports gambling. So this gave us the opportunity to start to expand into other verticals. And at that point, we were able to introduce sports betting and casino to the world. So in 2018, we launched our first sports book in the state of New Jersey. And then in 2019, we launched casino. And from there, we've been entering different states or provinces in Canada as they legalize sports betting and gambling. Today, we are operating in both Canada and the US as our primary customer base, and we have over 18 million active users. And like I said, we started with daily fantasy sports, and then starting in 2017, we were really able to pivot and continue to build out our product portfolio. So where we are today is we have 4 core verticals. So we have daily fantasy, sportsbook, casino, and marketplace. So that's a little bit about DraftKings. So now getting into tech interview process. So what I'm going to talk about today is mirrors the experience you may have if you were to interview at DraftKings, but at the same time, it also is very familiar to an experience you'd have at any company if you were interviewing for an engineering role or a role in technology. So whether you're interviewing at DraftKings or TripAdvisor or a HubSpot or a startup or Fidelity or a Microsoft, it's going to feel very similar. So the stages you go through in the interview process and the types of questions you can expect to see. So before I get into what are different stages of the interview process, I wanted to share just a few facts. And I know we probably all know this. We're sitting here today as the majority of us as females who work in the tech industry. So we can look around on a day-to-day basis and we realize that, there's not as many women as there are males in our field. But when you look at the numbers on a screen, it's still always staggering to me. So only about 15% of engineering jobs are held by women, and less than 20% of jobs and leadership positions are held by women in the tech industry. And this is always staggering because if we look around, right, in our day-to-day world, we know that the population is pretty even between 50-50 males and females. So, and I know we're all here today because we want to make a difference. And I know organizations like Women Who Code are doing everything they can to help continuing to empower women in this field, but still wanted to call that out. Then I also wanted to bring up the fact that almost 80% of us say that we experience imposter syndrome at work. I know personally, I have it weekly, if not daily. And we also know that women experience imposter syndrome more than men do. And the definition of imposter syndrome is the inability to believe in one's own success is deserved or has been legitimately achieved as a result of one's own efforts. And how that can hurt us, either showing up at work every day or showing up as an interview process, is if we are undervaluing who we are and not believing in what we've been able to accomplish, the world is not going to be able to value us for what we can do. So that's why imposter syndrome plays into, I think, our day-to-day interactions so much, and thinking about imposter syndrome and how we can overcome it is instrumental, I think, for all of us as we go about our day-to-day work life and if we go into an interview process. Okay, so when companies and recruiters and hiring managers think about the interview process, we typically break up the interview into 4 stages. So screen, assess, interview, and offer. So over my next couple slides, I'm going to get into each one of these stages and talk about what they mean, what you can expect, and how to be successful in each stage of the interview process. So the first stage is typically when you're going to have the opportunity to talk to a recruiter either over the phone or via Zoom. This is typically going to be a 20 or 30-minute interview where the recruiter is going to be digging into either your resume or LinkedIn profile to trying to get an understanding of big picture, what you've done in the past, what skills you have, and why you're interested in the position. What's really important about this stage is this is really sort of the recruiter is the gatekeeper to get you to the next stages and give you the opportunity to talk to either the hiring manager or other engineers on the team. So it's really, really important that you take this round seriously and showcase what you'd be bringing to the table. Where we see people struggle in this part of the interview process is that they don't take it seriously, or they don't view it as the first step in the actual interview process. So what I mean by this is, right, taking the phone call from the car or taking the call from a busy place where you can't really hear very well or the recruiter can't hear your answers. And then just not being prepared for it, not having done any, preliminary investigation on the company or even who the person is that you're talking to, not thinking about any questions that you want to ask. So that's my parting sort of takeaway from this is make sure you prepare for this initial conversation with the recruiter as you would for any interview with either a hiring manager or someone else on the engineering team that you'll be talking to. After this stage, you'll be moving into what we call the assess stage. And during the assess stage, this is where companies are really going to be looking at your technical skills. So there's two different types of interviews that could take place during this stage. The first one might be a takeaway online coding challenge. So typically companies may use a HackerRank or they might have a homegrown system. But what they're going to do is they're going to send you a link to an online coding challenge. And you'll typically have a couple days or a week to complete this phase. And typically it's going to take you anywhere from an hour to 2 hours. And what we're looking for is really we're just digging into your CS fundamentals. Typically you can take the challenge in any coding language you want. And we just want to make sure you have the basic skills to get through the rest of the interview process. What's really important here is that when you get this link, you think about, if you have 7 days to complete it, what's the best day for me to do this? When am I going to have a block of 2 hours to focus, sit in a room by myself, and actually do this challenge? And a lot of times these tests will give you a practice test so you can get used to the technology. You can see what type of coding challenge you're going to take. And we highly recommend you do that. Where we see people struggle with this portion of the interview is that they don't set aside enough time. So they end up starting it and then needing to stop and then going back to it. And maybe they timed out and didn't have the full amount of time to complete the challenge. Or they struggle with the technology. They don't have good internet connection. So these are all simple things you can avoid just by planning and making sure you make the time to take this test. The other type of interviews you may see in this stage of the interview process is either a coding challenge or a coding sort of problem or like an OO design. And this is when you're going to have the chance to either on a virtual whiteboard or if you're in person, a real whiteboard, walk through a problem with the interviewer. The interviewer is going to be someone who sits on, the team that you're interviewing for, who is an engineer. And what we're looking for in this stage of the process is to see how you think through a problem. What we're really looking for is for someone to walk us through how they're solving the problem. So as you're writing out the problem, as you're doing it, that you're also sharing with your interviewer why you're coming up with the answers you are. And if you come to a point where you're like, which way should I go? That you're asking that question. We're looking for someone who wants to collaborate. We're looking for someone who can talk through a problem with a coworker and can take direction. Your interviewer there is to help you solve the problem. So if you ask, they're going to be able to give you tips or tricks and point you in the right direction. Where we see people really fall down in this portion of the interview is when they don't sort of share how they're thinking through the problem. We don't need you to solve the problem 100% accurate every time, but we do want to know how you thought through the problem. Maybe you got through 80% of it, but you had a really good thought process. That's what we want to see. We also, sometimes see people who are working with the interviewer and the interviewer tries to redirect them and they challenge it or get argumentative. That's always sort of a red flag for interviewers in this stage because they're looking for someone who can collaborate and come to a solution together. After you get through this stage, you're so close to the end of the process. Typically, we would do this, most companies will call this your on-site phase. In the world we're living in, right, it might be a virtual on-site or it might be an in-person on-site, depending the company. But you're typically going to have anywhere from 2 to 4 more interviews. And this part of the interview process is going to focus heavily on behavioral interviewing. So some of the types of interviews you can expect to see is a technical deep dive. This is where it's really, really important when you're preparing for this part of the interview is that you've reviewed your resume, reviewed your LinkedIn profile. You are 100% confident you can talk about anything that you sort of put out to the world as a project you've worked on, as a position that you had. And you should also think about examples that you'd want to give about projects you've worked on. And it's not just the, 2-line sentence, here's what I did. The interviewer is going to ask you the what's, the whys, the hows, the business impact. So really be prepared to go deep on some of those technical projects you've worked on. The other type of question you're going to see here is just overall team fit. And that's really to make sure that you have the skills to collaborate and work in a collaborative environment. They're going to be asking questions about how you've worked with stakeholders in the past, how you've worked with coworkers, how you resolve conflict. And again, make sure before you go into this interview that you've thought of examples you could give. My suggestion would be, Google top tech interviews, interview questions. So that way you can get a sense of what questions you might be asked and think through the examples that you would give. And then finally, in this stage, you're probably going to have, if you are interviewing for a people manager role, you're going to have a people manager interview. And this is where someone's going to be digging into your people management philosophy, how you've led teams in the past, how you've helped your team members get promoted, how you've helped them succeed in the workplace, how you've dealt with low performers, how you've resolved conflict on your team. So again, this is your chance throughout this whole process to really own the narrative. You are going to get to give the examples that you want to give. So it's really important that you prepare and think about the examples that are going to highlight you in the best light. Some things to stay away from or like pitfalls to avoid in this process is not being able to go in depth on any of the stories that you're sharing, right? Because if you can only talk about it at the surface level, your interviewer is going to know that. And when they start to dig in deeper, you're going to struggle to come up with more information. So make sure whatever you're talking about, that you can really, give a good story behind it. The other thing is you're going to get pushed on situations about difficult coworkers, conflict resolution, projects that didn't go well. And these are all tough situations to talk about, right? We've all had coworkers we don't like. We've all probably had bosses that we haven't liked or workplaces that we didn't like. But there's a way to explain those situations in a respectful way versus talking very negatively about either people or your prior company. So it's thinking about how you can showcase some of those difficult situations in the workplace without getting into negativity or using negative language or swear words. So that's where that can come off as a red flag when we're interviewing people, is if they aren't able to sort of show that they learned from the experience and they're able to look back in a respectful manner. And then at this point, your interview process is done. And then the next step that you're going to be waiting for is to hear back from the recruiter, and in best case scenario, you're getting an offer. In the majority of cases, it's going to be the recruiter who is going to be extending the offer to you. And during this phase of the interview process, you should view the recruiter as your best friend. The recruiter is there to actually advocate for you. They've helped you through this journey, and our role at a company is to hire the best people for the job. And if you're getting the offer, the recruiter wants to make sure that we can land you at DraftKings or whatever company you're interviewing for. And they are going to be advocating for you and trying to help you get the best offer you can get to be happy about working at the company. What's typically going to happen is the recruiter is going to come out with the offer for you. And when you're thinking about the offer, you should think about it as, yes, we all care about cash, right? Base, bonus. But then there's other parts of the offer that you should take into consideration. So equity, what type of benefits like medical, dental, paid time off? Do you get to work remote? Is it a hybrid environment? Is it a really cool office space? So think about the package in its entirety, not just, right, base bonus, because there's so much more to an offer than just that one component. And once you get the offer, it's definitely okay to take the offer right after you get off the phone, think about it, and then come back to negotiate. And my recommendation, after all my time of doing this, and when it's come to me, I hate doing it as well, but definitely negotiate. The worst that's going to happen is that you're going to be told no. And that's not a big deal. A company is not going to take your offer away, isn't going to change your offer negatively just because you asked for more. So if you ask, then at least you know that you didn't leave anything on the table. But what's really important when you're asking for something, whether it's a couple thousand more in base or you want to sign on, is the why. If you just come back and say, this offer, doesn't meet my expectations, I just want more, that's really hard for the recruiter and the hiring manager and the company to understand what you're looking for. Whereas if you come back with, I'm really excited about this offer. I was hoping my base salary could be $3,000 more or $5,000 more. And the reason is, at my previous company, I was making, this amount, and I was up for a raise in the next month. And I really, would really make me feel better about the offer. Or, I'm asking for a sign-on because my commute's going to be a little bit longer and my transportation costs are going to be more. Because this allows the recruiter to go back to the business and the hiring manager and advocate for the reasons that you're asking for something additional. And it's much easier for a company to understand and say, yes, of course, if they understand the reasons why you're asking for it. The other thing in this stage that's really, really important is taking a step back and thinking about not only the offer is perfect, you're getting everything you wanted there, but did you like the people that you interviewed with? Throughout the process, did you get a feeling of these people are smart? I would want to work with them. I could see myself in meetings with them every day. We spend a ton of time at work, So it's so important to make sure you're picking a company where you feel like you're going to enjoy the environment that you're working in addition to getting paid what you're worth. So to wrap up, and then I'm happy to answer any questions because I'm hoping I left enough time, right, to at least leave 5 or 10 minutes for questions. But as a takeaway, really when I think about how you're going to set yourself up for success in the interview process, and even how I think about when I go to interview processes, right, what I think about and how I get ready is 3 things. The first one is preparation, and this is twofold. First, you want to make sure you're prepared in knowing your value and knowing what you're going to share with the company. So this is reviewing your resume, reviewing your LinkedIn profile, thinking about how you're going to answer different interview questions that you might be asked, thinking of really good examples and what you want the company for each interviewer to take away after meeting with you. The other piece of this is prepare yourself about the company. Spend time doing some research on the company, look on LinkedIn, the interviewers you're going to meet with, and make sure you have a list of questions that you actually want to know about the job or the company. So when you go to each interview, you are very prepared, not only to answer the questions that you're going to be asked, but to also answer the questions, or also to ask the questions that you want answers to. And the other 2 things I sort of tie together, presence and passion. Even though we're living in a very different world than we were 3 years ago, where we are working from home more, we may be interviewing virtually in a lot more cases, it's still important to think about how you're showing up, even on a screen, like where you're taking your calls from, what your background looks like, what you're wearing. First impressions still matter, even if they're on video. So really think about, for every interview, how you're going to show up, and then also the passion piece. What you want your interviewer to take away from the interview with you is that where you are excited and enthusiastic about this process. You are excited about DraftKings or the company you're interviewing with. You're excited to meet with this hiring manager. And most importantly, you're excited to share your background. You're excited to tell them why you are the best candidate for the job. And I think if you do yourself a disservice if you don't go into each interview really taking the time to prepare and think about how you're going to set yourself up for success. Because if you do all of these things, you're going to be putting forward your best self, and that's going to reflect very positively on you throughout the process with the company. And that's it. So I'd love to hear some questions from all of you in the audience.
Wonderful. I know that there are going to be a lot of questions. We've had a lot of questions that have come up in the chat throughout your talk. This has been a fantastic amount of information that you shared with our community. I really appreciate getting to hear this behind the scenes view of what to expect. It looks like we have a question here. Sometimes the technical interview time is limited. So how can we go in depth without taking too much time?
Yeah, that's a great question because exactly, we're always constrained with time. Typically, you're going to have 45 minutes, maybe 60 minutes if you're lucky. I think it's being really thoughtful about listening to the questions that's asked. And right, so you make sure you're staying on point to the key things you need to answer. So whether it's a behavioral portion, like what is this interviewer looking for and how can I make sure I get across these 3 main points? Or if it's more of they're working through a problem, you can always ask for a time check, or you say like, hey, I can go into more depth here, but I also want to get to this piece of the problem. And I know we only have 15 minutes left, and ask the interviewer what they want to know most.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's so great to make sure that first off, you're answering the questions that are being presented to you, but then to ask for feedback from the interviewer. I love that. Yeah. I know that we had a couple of people who even shared in the chat here that they have an interview coming up next week. And so this information has been really important for them. Another question for you. We all struggle at some point with an interview while we're job searching, but it can be vital to experience and then learn from the mistakes. How should we ask a recruiter for feedback?
Yep, and that's very true. Like you're not going to get every job you interview for, right? I haven't. I'm sure we all haven't. But sometimes it doesn't mean we didn't have the skills. It could just mean another candidate was a little bit better in something. So that's why it's so important to ask for their feedback. And again, I think every recruiter is happy to give feedback. I typically would suggest starting with your recruiter and saying, is there any feedback that you have throughout this process for me? Like where I maybe fell short or even what I did really well. Typically, a recruiter is not going to put this information or a hiring manager in an email. So what you want to ask for is there a time we could chat so you could walk me through some of these? So it's being open enough to hear the feedback in a live conversation, because you're not going to get as in-depth feedback over email. But recruiters will always be willing, and hiring managers in most cases want to help candidates learn from their mistakes and are willing to provide some of that feedback.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you all are the experts in the field, so it's good to get that information. Another question here. Let's say that you totally bomb the technical side of the interview. What's the best way to handle that? Would it be I didn't know this, but I will find out kind of response? Or
yes, it is 100% better just to say and be truthful. Like I have come to a point where I do not know how to move forward. Like I have not seen this or done this before, because the interviewer is going to respect that more than if you just try to make up your way as you go through it, because they're going to see that and say unfortunately, I just haven't learned this, or I don't know how to do it, but can you walk me through it? Or I can take it away and I'd love to be able to get back to you with an answer. And we see that sometimes in candidates who know they struggled in the interview, and what they'll do is they'll follow up within 24 hours to the hiring manager, typically with, I know I struggled on this point, reflecting on it, I've actually thought about it and this would be the answer I'd give. Or I realized I need more experience in OO design. Is there anything else that might be a fit at your company that doesn't require this skill?
Oh, wonderful. So asking for that feedback along the way.
Asking for that feedback, because maybe there is another position that doesn't require that skill, and it's better to be honest and sort of know your strengths and weaknesses than trying to hide your weaknesses for that matter.
So not necessarily faking it till you make it is always the best case. Okay.
Exactly.
That's very great. All right. Another question that we have. Can you share some tips for passing the screening stage as a new boot camp graduate?
Yep. So I think it's really important at this stage that when you're talking to the recruiter, because your background, right, may be a little different than someone who might be coming out of a traditional 4-year, CF program, is really highlighting what skills you've learned in the boot camp, and even where you're going to need some additional support at the company. Because when we have boot camp candidates, that's really helpful for us, because we will tailor our interview process to say, we know that maybe they didn't learn XYZ yet, so we're not going to ask them those questions, but we know we have a role that will be able to help develop those skills. So in that screen stage, if you really have that open conversation with the recruiter, that will go a long way. Or the recruiter might say, I need you to have this, but at least and you're not setting yourself up to go in an interview that you're not able to do.
I love that. It seems like communication is just the key to so much of your success throughout this process. I love that. And a similar question, we had another person who asked if you have a non-traditional route into tech. What are some ideas or some tips to be successful there?
Yep, I think it's making sure you can, again, communicate your story. Here's what I learned in the past, and maybe what I did in the past, these skills have really helped me get to here, and now these are the skills I've developed. And I am making a career change, or I am doing sort of a pivot, and here's why I'm doing it. For us and for all the companies I've worked at, and for most of my colleagues, career changers are great. If anything, it just gives you a different viewpoint than maybe someone who traditionally grew up in sort of that space right out of college, right through.
I love that. So I loved your conversation about being present and thinking about how you're presenting yourself in an interview, even in an online setting. And there have been a couple of questions about that. Can you speak more about what you mean when you're talking about presence in an online setting? Any tips for your background or any other presentation ideas that you've used in the past?
Yeah, so I think for your background, unless you have a like office that you work from home in and that you sit in every day that you know is sort of like appropriate, like for instance, like I have an office in Trite Food Facility. I'm in like a house sort of construction, so it's a mess. So I have my background on Blur today because I think Blur at least like wipes out sort of the details of it. Or a lot of people will use backgrounds, either the just sort of plain white one or one of the ones you find online that sort of just show like a room in the background. I always think that's a better option than just showing like your kitchen or whatever random room you're sitting in. And just making sure you're in like a quiet space where you know you're not going to get sort of interrupted or there's not going to be random people sort of walking back and forth between you. But then also think about what you're wearing too, right? At least from the waist up. Like, and if you're not going to stand up. But like, right, some people have sweatpants on all the time, but then their tops, right, they like have more appropriate clothing. And for an interview, it doesn't need to be a suit or it doesn't need to be even business casual, but it just wants to look like you put time into getting ready that morning.
Right, right. You want to demonstrate that you are excited about this opportunity.
Yeah.
You've prepared yourself. You've done your research about the company. I know that there were a couple of questions in the chat about that as well, doing those deep dives into researching and preparing for an interview. Any tips or suggestions there?
Hold on, I'm just like reading the question too.
Yeah. So I'll read it out loud for people.
Yeah, I can, yep.
Oh, you got it? Okay.
Yep, I got it. So I think that whenever you're interviewing, your interviewer is going to know the level you're at. So like the questions they're going to ask someone who has 10 years, as a senior or lead software engineer or someone coming right out of a boot camp, they're going to tailor their questions, or like someone coming right out of college. We don't expect you to be able to go as deep into like a problem or a project if this is your first job or like you've only worked for 1 or 2 years, whereas someone who is leading a project who's 10 or 15 years in. So I think but I think the key to that is making sure you prepare in advance, think about the examples you're going to give and what you're going to share about them. And really that's the piece. You don't want to get into the interview sharing something you haven't really thought about in 3 years, and then you're like stuck on like explaining the question. So this is your chance to make sure you're picking the examples you want to share and you're able to give enough of a story.
I love that. Yeah, you don't want the first time that you're telling a story to be in an interview. You haven't thought about all of the different pieces of it quite yet. I love that. And in the chat, they talked about that quite a bit too. So another question for you. Should I still apply and go with interviews if I know that I'm missing a skill from the requirements list, or maybe I have a very similar skill set? So maybe I worked in one framework, but this framework over here is required.
I'm so happy this question was asked because I actually thought about this when I was putting my presentation together. There's research that shows like a male will apply for a job if they meet like 2 of the requirements out of like 10. Yep. And that females feel like they need to meet every single requirement before they'd even raise their hand for a job or apply. So 100%, you do not need to have every skill that's listed. Think about it. Like if you have a couple of the skills, but you're smart and you're passionate and you know you can learn it, you should still apply. And that's what you're going to talk about during the interview. On that first screen stage, the recruiter is going to ask you that, and they're going to get a sense of what you actually have done and what you're going to need to learn. And the truth is, as a recruiter working with hiring managers, we put that requirement list together, but the question we always ask is, what is your 1 or 2 non-negotiables that you absolutely need to have? And what are the other nice to have? So we never expect anyone coming into the interview to have every one of those requirements.
That is some very helpful information to know. And yeah, that's something that I've seen both from friends and talking to them and also myself too. I haven't applied for jobs in the past because I didn't fit every single expectation listed there. So I appreciate you sharing that with the group for sure. Another question that we have here, do you have any input about entering the tech industry after parenting? I know that you shared that you are a parent yourself. Would you recommend including full-time parenting on a resume, particularly if the experience and skills from this are part of your story, or is the mom penalty too strong?
So I personally want to say the mom penalty is not too strong. Like, and I
Mm,
actually think over the past 3 years, like good or bad, what COVID has done to the world, I
mm,
actually think has been a shift in this, not just because of people taking time off for having kids, but I think just life, right? There were circumstances that
right,
were just crazy, right? That
right.
happened, that people had to step away from work for a period of time. And I think it's 100% okay. And I think how you own that is you have it on your LinkedIn profile, you have it on your resume, and you explain, like, if you have a 3-year block, just say, like, right, you're like, um, time off to care for family, right? What I'd rather see is someone saying what they did for that block versus just ignoring it. Because ignoring
Mm,
it, like, could make a hiring manager or recruiter think, like, did this person wasn't able to get a job? Did they just not feel like working? Whereas then that shows, no, I was actually doing something that I would argue is even more important than my job will ever be. So I think it's just being open and honest about that. Like, hey, I took 2 years off and now I'm ready to get back into the workspace. And because of this time off, I'm actually more refreshed and recharged and excited, you know, to get back into my career.
absolutely. I think it keeps going back to that communication is so key here. So I
Yeah.
love hearing you say that. It looks like we have time for two more questions here.
Okay.
We are wrapping up the conversation. I know that if you are interested in finding out more about DraftKings, I know DraftKings will be in the expo booth sessions later, so I want to make sure I give a plug for that. There are some people in the chat who are asking for accommodations during interviews. Any advice in having that conversation?
Yep. Definitely address it in the first step of the process, right up front. If you're going to need accommodations, definitely talk about it in the first, like, typically the recruiter, but the first interview you have, or even before that recruiter stage, if you're going back and over email to set it up and say you're hearing impaired, right? Just say that and say, I use this like typing software,
Mhm.
or I'm going to need XYZ, because every company is going to want to help accommodate for what you're going to need. It's really tough for us is if you don't bring it up till after the interview process. And
Mm,
then you say, I don't feel like I was able to do as well as I could have because I actually, for XYZ reason, because then it's very hard for us to go back and like rectify sort of the situation that already happened. So just ask up front would be my advice.
okay, love that. And this is our last question that we're going to be wrapping up today's conversation with. And while we're pulling that up, Diana, I just wanted to thank you for sharing all of this experience and expertise. It's been really a fruitful conversation. It says here some companies put into the job post to say no negotiating, that this is the final salary offer. Any advice or thoughts on those situations?
Well, my personal opinion is that I don't think companies should say that, or like I just
Mm,
don't understand like what value that adds to a job posting. But even if it says no negotiating, I think you bring it up as right. I'm not, I know that your job post said no negotiating. I'm just letting you know that based on this offer, like, and I have a longer commute now, I would be looking on for a sign on. So you sort of address the fact to pretend like you don't want to pretend that you didn't see that it said it, but I think you just say, I know it said this, but I'm just letting you know I would have liked, or I would be looking for this when I consider my offer. So at least the company then knows how you're thinking. And they may still choose like we can't move it, do anything, but again, at least you still put it out there.
yeah. And in that response too, you've shown that you've done your research. You've really looked into the process and know what the company is expecting. So
Exactly.
yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, again, Diana, thank you so much. This has been incredible information. Thank you so much to our community for sharing your thoughts and feedback throughout and asking fantastic questions. Thank you to DraftKings for sponsoring this event. And Diana, I really appreciate you being part of the community and sharing your expertise with us today.
Great. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.